All right, so here we go. All right, well, hey, we are here. We don't know what to call this thing other than just a midweek kind of recap, just recapping Sunday's message. Yesterday, we started a new series called Wonderfully Made, and we just wanted to answer some of your questions that you sent in, and then we also just wanted to just talk about the message.
Yeah, touch base, maybe recap a little bit on what we talked about on Sunday in case you forgot or weren't here, or you want it in a condensed bite-sized form, although I don't know how condensed this will actually end up being. So, yeah.
All right, so why don't we start with what the message was about, Phil?
So as we begin this Wonderfully Made series, we're talking about the human body, sexuality, gender, purpose, identity, all of these different things. Really, Sunday's message was the foundation for that. Like, why does the body matter? Because before we can answer any of these questions about, like, well, what should we do with our body? What's right? What's wrong? What's permissible? What's not? A lot of conversations that we're having in culture, and this bleeds out into conversations with people we know. This bleeds out into politics. This bleeds out into relationships. But before we get to answering any of those questions, I think we first have to start with, well, what is this thing that we call our bodies, or the human body in general? And from our perspective as pastors and as a church, like, what does God say about our body?
Right.
Specifically, as we look through the scriptures, like the teaching of Scripture, the story of Scripture, the teaching of Jesus, what is this thing that we call our body? So that was really what yesterday was. See, I'm gonna try really hard not to do that because it's Monday, y'all. It's Monday when we're recording this, and it's probably not gonna come out till Wednesday. And I'm gonna keep wanting to say yesterday's message.
That's all right.
Yeah. Someone's be like,
Practice.
I missed Tuesday church. Dang it.
So in the message, you were talking about the image of God, and you started out with Genesis 1:27 through 28, where God says that, in God created them male and female. In the image of God, he had created them male and female. So unpack that idea of being made in God's image.
Yeah. So I think a lot of times we may be as Christians familiar with this verse, but we don't necessarily linger on it. We don't dwell on it. We don't meditate on it as much as we should as far as the implications go. Like, to be made in God's image, sometimes it's almost like, oh yeah, we get that humans are made in God's image. And then we just kind of leave it there, and that idea doesn't come into other areas of life. But it is the primary identity and purpose of every human being is to bear God's image or to be his image. And so this idea of in the creation narrative, and I didn't get into the message, we didn't have time to. But one of the things that scholars see in the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, like the creation account, is what is called temple imagery. Right? So in the ancient Near Eastern world that the Hebrew text, what we call the Old Testament, is produced in, we have works of, literary works from other cultures. We have inscriptions from other cultures, and we can see how they would build temples, and they would fill temples, and then dedicate their temples to a particular deity or a god. The Genesis account is very, very similar, with the difference being, okay, the God of the Jewish people is not just, he doesn't live in just a building. Like, all of creation, the entire cosmos is his dwelling place. But where humanity becomes interesting in that is in all these other temples, they put a statue. They put an idol statue for people to go in. It's like, oh, there's the little statue that you bow down to, or it represents the God. In the Genesis account, that image is humans. So God dwells in his cosmic temple, but the thing that is meant to then be his representatives to creation, and also kind of be there's like this idea of co-regency, of ruling and working on his behalf. It's humans in the biblical story. And so that idea is the foundational, again, I said identity and purpose of every human, is that you're made to reflect the image of God, and then to carry on this idea of bringing about life and flourishing in the same way that God brought order out of the chaos in the Genesis account. And so because of that, image of God is not something that people can ever gain. It's not something that they can lose. It's not something that's like, oh, I've got enough experience now, I've earned enough money now, I've got enough status now, I'm an image bearer. And It's not like, oh, I'm old and I'm feeble, or maybe I don't feel like I'm that intelligent. So I lose the image of God. None of what we do affects that. That's something that is God-given. So yeah, like that. Then I went on to say is like that undergirds really all of Christian ethics. Like, well, why are we called to love our enemies and love our neighbors and care for the least of these? Because humans are made in the image of God.
Right.
It really becomes the foundation in Western culture and Western society. Like, we are so steeped in Christianity and what was known as Christendom, right? That you can't escape it. Human rights is birthed out of image of Godness. Because if humans aren't uniquely and distinctly different and valuable compared to everything else, well then why should there be human rights? But it's that image of God thing that becomes like this is at the center of all of that. So.
And so then that understanding of image of God is so foundational for understanding our purpose as human beings, what we were made to do, what our bodies were meant to do. And we see that most perfectly in the person of Jesus, in the incarnation of God becoming flesh, of John 1, the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. It's this idea that you mentioned in the message of Jesus putting on sarks of flesh, of blood, and,
it's like, ew.
and stuff. Yeah, if you're squeamish, you're not going to like the word sarks because it's that very idea of a physical embodiment that forever from the moment that Jesus was conceived in Mary's womb, he was bound to a body. Yeah. The Son from eternity past was now bound to eternity future in a physical body, that when Jesus was resurrected from the dead, that you said yesterday that there wasn't an empty body, there was an empty tomb, because Jesus rose bodily from the dead. Yeah. And that has huge implications for then where the story is going, for the value that God places on our bodies, on our flesh.
Yeah, because as that story kind of develops, like one of the unique things is that, you know, Jesus by the Apostle Paul is called the image of the invisible God, and he's picking up on that Genesis 1 idea. Like humanity we're supposed to be the image bearers. We suck at it, we fail at it, we blow it. Jesus shows up, and he's fully God, but he's also fully human. He's fully human as humans were meant to be. Right, like, hey, here, like this is what it looks like to be the image of God, in step with your Creator, not corrupted and fallen by sin. And then where that story goes then is, you know, it's resurrection, like you said, and Scripture calls him the first fruit. Like he's the first to be raised. Like he's going to have all these brothers and sisters, those of us that are followers of Jesus, that are going to be raised bodily as well. The Apostle Paul writes about that several places in his letters, of just like drilling down on the importance of Jesus rose, so we will rise. There's a physical resurrection coming for us. And we touched on that passage in 2 Corinthians, where he then says, so what we do in our earthly bodies in the present actually has, like it echoes into eternity. It's going to matter in our eternity. What we do in this body now is really what will be judged on. Right,
because we are not dualistic beings as has typically been thought of in Christian thought, that came actually from Greek philosophy and not actually from biblical understanding, where it's like we have a soul, we have a spirit, and we have a body. Yeah. It's like, no, we are embodied souls, that our souls was never meant to live divorced from our flesh, from our sarks, that the two are not separate when you go back to the creation account and to the Old Testament understanding of what our bodies and the image of God was meant to be.
Absolutely. We didn't get into that, but it's a cool thing to trace down at some point, to see like the history of like when that happened. One of the things about the early church that was so incredible is that the message of Jesus, the gospel, spread like wildfire. It went from being like a Jewish thing attached to the Jewish scriptures to being something that went out to the Gentiles, the Greeks, like everybody that was non-Jewish. And like, while that's a beautiful thing, in that transition, it ended up losing a lot of its Jewish roots, its Old Testament roots. And so, as you mentioned, you know, a lot of the kind of Greek philosophy thinking came into the church, and that dualism is a massive part of that.
Yeah, and it's still very much around today.
Yeah.
That's a popular level idea of humanity and of our being. I can remember my first class in grad school was all about the image of God, and us talking about this idea of, what is the nature of man? Do we have a body? Are we spirit, soul, and body? What does that look like? And I don't remember the position that I argued for, but it wasn't.
It's a long time ago, right?
It's almost been 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Actually, that was over 10 years ago that I had that first class.
Oh, man.
That really makes me feel old now.
Okay.
Thanks, Phil.
Hey, no problem.
But I don't even remember this idea, this Jewish understanding of, no, we're embodied souls, as being part of the conversation. It was this dualistic thinking that came not from Scripture, but from elsewhere.
Yeah. This is off topic. It's important to know we're all kind of products of our time and scholarship and stuff. And for a long time in the church, it seems like the Jewishness of the Christian faith and of the Scriptures was kind of cast aside, as if like, well, we don't need that. We've just got this understanding. And in more recent times, and when you're saying recent times in terms of church history, this 2,000 years old, it's like, recent times encompasses
Right.
a few hundred years. There's been I don't know if a rediscovery is the right word because it was always there, but there's been a lot of work done of people paying attention again to, hey, that Jesus was a first century Jew. He came out of this Jewish culture, came out of this Jewish religion. That as Jesus said, he didn't come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill them.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been a recapturing of that, which I think is a really good thing for
Yeah.
just for the church,
Yeah.
for the world really, because it gives us the full picture of who Jesus is and what he did.
Yeah.
And it relates to our bodies.
Yeah, and our full picture of what our humanity is supposed to be.
Absolutely.
I like what Bible Project says, that Jesus was the truly human one, that he's the image of what we were meant to be before sin entered the world. And there's a whole debate in this idea of image of God. Is the image lost? Is it corrupted? Is it tarnished in some way? And there's different scholars throughout time that have argued, no, the image of God was lost in some way when sin entered the world. And others said, no, it's just been corrupted. It's like the Apostle Paul said, we see in a glass dimly, but then we shall see fully.
Go ahead. I was
going to say, whenever we say that the image of God has been lost in humanity because of sin, then that takes away the image of God in us, and it justifies then,
it's a dangerous thing to do.
certain behaviors, because now we're not the image of God. Our neighbor that we might disagree with is not the image of God, and it can justify dehumanizing them.
Right. If the image of God is something that can be lost, and we think that way, then we look at our enemy and go, well, they must have lost the image of God, because clearly, they're. But whenever we have this understanding of like, no, you can't lose it. This is, I was going to ask, which scholar is it that calls us cracked icons or icons?
Scott McKnight writes about that, but I don't know if he was the one that originated that idea, if it was somebody else.
Like an icon in a temple. It's like that's what we were. It's like somebody dropped it and it's all cracked, and like a little kid broke something and tried to super glue it back together. Like that's how we're representing the image of God. It's very, very broken, but it's still in there somewhere. So.
Yeah, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but it relates to this. So one of the commandments is, you shall not make any graven image or any, picture of a god. And the reason is, we think that like, okay, whatever, we're not going to do that. But the reason is because God had already made images in humanity. Yep. And he couldn't do any better than what he had made.
Absolutely.
And so just, again, that command and the intent behind it and how much weight and value God placed on humanity is just so beautiful that when we really stop to reflect on it, it's just like, wow.
Yeah. So there in the commandments, you just made me think of something else. This is a tangent, but I think that's good what this podcast is. We want to help you to think more about what we've talked about on Sunday. If you're looking for this idea of the image of God as you read through the scriptures, it'll start jumping off the page at you. So that idea of the commandment, well, don't make an image because God's already made images. I'm thinking of Jesus when he's pressed on paying taxes and like, well, should we pay taxes or not? He's like, pull out a coin. Whose image is on it? And they're like, well, Caesar. He says, so give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. And so whose image is on the coin? Caesar's. Whose image is on you? God. So give to God what is it? He's saying like, you give all of yourself.
Yeah.
You are his image. You give so like that idea. It's all throughout. It's so cool. So cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So what are the implications then? Kind of like wrapping up our summary of the message then for the image of God in us and how we see other people.
What you do, like how you treat your body matters, and how you treat other bodies matters. So, especially as it relates to your Christian faith, it's not something that is merely intellectual, philosophical. It's not just in your mind. It's not Jesus doesn't just live in your heart. But how we view our bodies matters. In this series, we're talking about we're going to be talking about identity and purpose and sexuality and gender and how we use our bodies in those ways. But there are a lot of things in the church where this image of God gets ignored. And I'm not talking about like legalistic things where people are like, well, your body is a temple. I'm like, okay, yes, it does say that, but that is specifically talking about sexual immorality. But really, like, how do we care for our bodies?
Yeah.
We have limitations. Okay, we're mortal, and how we care for these things. Like, are we resting? Because if we have a proper view of our bodies and the image of God, like rest is a big thing. Like basically, what kind of stuff are you putting into this thing? food and exercise and substances, and not in a legalistic way that's
Right.
like, here are the do's and don'ts, because again, and here's what this message was about. It's like, get to the thing underneath of that. Our physicalness is good. So it's got implications for that. It's got implications for how we live and worship. I mentioned in the message, there is no way of actually living out your faith that doesn't involve your body, your hands, your ears, your eyes, your brain.
You mentioned Dallas Willard and
Oh
that
gosh,
idea
I love
of
Dallas Willard.
that if we're going to follow Jesus, it involves our flesh, our body, and that's the only way that we can follow Jesus. And so we must do things, discipline ourselves, and bring our flesh under his lordship.
Yep.
And what that looks like. And there's disciplines that highly recommend you read the book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, if you haven't.
It's a classic.
It's a classic,
so
well written, and it's just like, so applicable for today. You'd think that he wrote it like in 2023, but it's written in 1988.
Yeah. Don't expect it to be a fast read. It's a pretty thick book, and like you got to read and reread some things. I mean, it's easy to understand like the words on the page, but then you're like, yeah, but very good. Like take 3 or 4 months and read through that book slowly and let that sit. But yeah, so all of that then just to say is like Sunday's message was about laying this foundation of we can't write off what we do to, with, or in our bodies, or the way that we see other people's bodies. Our culture really says they're disposable, and the Christian witness is they're not. They're tied to, again, your soul, right? There is a immaterial soul part of you, but your body's attached. You can't divide the two.
Yeah.
Before we talk about some of the more, I don't know, controversial is not the right word, but just the culturally heated things that we're going to talk about in this series. We have to understand how and why God has made this body.
Right, because that lays the foundation for understanding why Scripture takes a certain position on what we do with our bodies, because we are made in the image of God. All right, so we had some questions come in, and I want to...
Good questions, too. Way to go. If you
way to go, guys. We said we'd be anonymous with these, so we're not going to share names.
Yeah. Before you read those, again, we'll be doing this every week for this series.
Yeah.
So keep the questions coming. There may be some questions that if you ask, we might not answer that week. If I know we're going to talk about that in a message, right? So but keep the questions coming. We'll keep doing this.
Yeah, these two questions today happen to come from yesterday's message, so it's not like it's future stuff. So, first question: the disciples saw Lazarus raised from the dead. Why do they find it so hard to believe Jesus was raised from the dead?
That's a good question.
That's a good question.
I think there's a couple layers to that question. I think just the first one is that the disciples had a hard time believing most things that Jesus said and did. Like it took several. They were, and this is not accusingly, because we're the same way. They were hard-headed and hard-hearted, right?
Yeah.
Thick skull, and it was just like, what? I don't get it. And that's just part of the human condition to doubt when it matters of faith.
Yeah, and Lazarus's sister Martha said, "I know he will be raised in the last days."
Yeah.
And so it's possible that the disciples, they also believed in a bodily resurrection, but not then. But not when Jesus,
it's at the wrong point in the timeline.
Yeah, it's like, no, this was supposed to be on the day of the Lord, not now. We're not going to unpack Day of the Lord. Look up Bible Project video and podcast series on Day of the Lord.
So good.
Fantastic.
I think one of the other things that would be at play with the Lazarus situation, though, as well, is that, okay, the disciples saw Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. Like Jesus was the one with the power to do that. He acted upon someone else. And also actually with the little girl, that some of them saw that. And so it's like, okay, cool, he can do that. He has the power to do that. But how can he have the power to do that if he himself is dead? So I think that's where there's a little bit of a difference. I was like, well, he can raise other people, but if he's dead himself.
No, there's nobody to raise him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I think this just came to my head. It might not be theologically accurate. So, I think that speaks to the Trinity, though. Because, we reread the Apostle Paul talk about the same Spirit that raised Christ from the dead is now alive in you. And so it's like, okay, yeah, like the Son and Jesus, like the bodily, like he died, but like God, the fullness of the Godhead was not dead, right? And so the Spirit was still raised Jesus from the dead. So I don't know, right? Is that what?
Oh, I just thought of a particular song from a particular Christian band about that idea of God's not dead. So we're going to move on.
I'm not going to sing. I'm not going to sing. I'm not going to sing. Okay. Yeah.
The next question, will our bodies be remade if we are cremated after death?
So this is a question I've heard. We got it here at our church, but I've heard a lot of people ask others. It's such a good question. It's a very insightful question to be like, okay, if our bodies are going to be physical, what if our bodies get destroyed? That's a great question.
Yeah.
And sometimes people just phrase it simply as like, is it okay for Christians to be cremated? Right? Like we'll add a moral aspect to it as well.
Right. I can remember somebody asking this very question in one of my classes in grad school, and the professor saying, I don't know, but it's the ultimate act of recreation. Absolutely. When there's literally like nothing left of your physical body for God to raise that from the dead. I imagine that God can still do that, and that if you're cremated, your body's destroyed in some way after death, God can still raise you, that you will have a physical resurrection body.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody who dies before the return of Jesus is going to have some pretty serious physical work done too. Like you're just talking about levels of being remade physically at that point. We think throughout all of human history, all the people who have been faithful to God that will be raised to life in resurrection. I mean, I don't know how long it takes for a body to completely break down, but there are faithful, like God-following people that are completely gone. Like even if they were buried physically, like they have decomposed, turned to dust.
Yeah, the bones are gone.
The bones are gone. And so it's like, well, if that's true, or if someone is in an accident and there's like a fire and like just completely burned up, or you get lost at sea and eaten by sharks. Right? I mean, I've heard somebody give that example before. That's why I came up. And it's like, well, I'm now been through the digestive system of a shark, and I'm whatever. It's like, so I think when we think about it in those terms, it's like, oh, cremation isn't the only thing that would destroy a human body.
Right.
Time does that as you're buried. So
yeah, and you look at the Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel, and you see this empty valley that's filled with all these bones that they were just bones. It doesn't look like a physical skeleton. So a way you could say that body has been destroyed because it doesn't make sense. It's all mangled, jumbled up, jumbo, mumbo, jumbo, gumbo. But yet God raises, in Ezekiel's vision, those bones to life again, that they begin to come together. And even in Jewish tradition, when they would bury somebody, they'd place them in a tomb, allow them to decay, and come back a year later, take their bones and put them in an ossuary, in a box. Again, that body isn't connected anymore, and yet there was still hope and resurrection.
Yeah. So yeah, I think cremation is just fine. Again, like you said, it's the ultimate act of recreation. God in the beginning, like just by His word, by His speaking, can bring that wasn't to become. You know what I mean? Like it's out of nothing. So yeah, I think, and the whole concept of like, well, is it going to be these? Like even if you're buried and embalmed and in pristine shape when Jesus comes back, I don't think that particular body is going to be raised exactly. You know what I mean? It's like there's going to be a recreating that's happening on some level. Who knows what we're going to look like? That's just a fun question to ask anyway. Like, what are we going to look like?
I don't know.
Will I have hair? Will I not have hair? Am I going to be 20-year-old me, 30-year-old me? Some combination. We trust that God's making all things new, including these physical bodies, and it's coming.
It's coming. All right.
I think that's everything for today.
Thanks for sending in those questions. Keep them coming, and we'll be back here next week with another unpacking of a message.
See you Sunday.